Welcome to A Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. My name's Mark Evans and I'm Director of the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis here at the University of Canberra, and I'm deputising for the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Deep Saini. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Mark.
Welcome to A Week in Politics, and it's been a tumultuous week in politics.
Certainly has been.
The government's just announced a Royal Commission on the financial services sector, following a letter from the Big Four banks. This is obviously in the aftermath of the announcement in the last budget. And this clearly comes on the back of some strong pressure from national backbenchers. So what do you think is happening here? Do you think this is going to be lead to an embarrassing flip for the Prime Minister?
Well, it's a huge backflip. Even until earlier this week, the Prime Minister was insisting there would be no Royal Commission into the banks. He was categoric. But the National Party rebels were pushing a backbench bill which would have set up a parliamentary commission, which is essentially like a Royal Commission. And they had the numbers. A couple of them were going to cross the floor in the lower house, and the government really had to capitulate. But it is difficult, it's embarrassing. You can see the government's reluctance. It's essentially saying, look, this was better than the alternative. It was better that we take over this inquiry and set the terms of reference and choose who does it than leave it to the Parliament. So certainly not the way Malcolm Turnbull would have wanted to end the parliamentary year, or nearly end it.
How trusting is he going to look in the context of this backflip? How's that going to impact on his personal popularity?
Well, I think actually, rather paradoxically, the public will be quite pleased to see a Royal Commission, because if the public doesn't trust the politicians, it trusts the banks even less. So people will think, well, it'll be good to really get behind how they've acted and see something of the culture exposed. But what it does show is that clearly the Prime Minister is in a very weak position, and when pressure comes on, he has no option, no authority really to resist it and stare it down.
So let's turn now to Barnaby Joyce. It looks likely that he'll win the by-election and will return to government. Has the Prime Minister missed Barnaby Joyce? Has it left sort of a vacuum in terms of how he manages the National Party in particular in the coalition?
I think that the fact that Barnaby Joyce was absent meant that the rebel nationals on the banking issue, for example, had more opportunity to exert pressure and play their own power politics. On the other hand, on that issue, I think that Barnaby Joyce was aware of the strong feeling in the National Party and in the grassroots supporters of the Nationals, and really was going with the flow. He wasn't trying, even from a distance, to say, no, don't do this, chaps, you know, you must behave. He was saying, oh, well, the party room can discuss what it likes. It'll be after the by-election on Saturday, and that's all fine. So he was giving sort of tacit approval to what was happening.
Let's now turn to Parliament. The same-sex marriage bill passed the Senate this week with no substantive amendments, but it now heads to the lower house, where there's expected to be some pressure from MPs to push for religious protections. How difficult do you think this final hurdle of the bill is going to be?
I think it'll get through pretty easily, and I'd be surprised if there was much amendment. I think the numbers are there to carry it without substantive amendment. And now there are a couple of amendments that were moved in the Senate by George Brandis. They failed, but they're probably borderline in terms of whether they could get up or not. But basically, the big thrust by the Conservatives, I think, has failed and will continue to fail.
And look, if it's been a difficult week for the Prime Minister, it's also turning into a difficult week for the opposition as well, isn't it? Bill Shorten has forced Labour Senator Sam Dastyari to quit as opposition deputy whip in the Senate amid further revelations about his dealings with a Chinese national of interest to Australian security agencies. But now the government is demanding that he leaves Parliament altogether. Where do you think this is likely to lead? I
think there'll be continued pressure on Sam Dastyari. I think that the issue is quite serious, obviously, because what he did was to tip off this man that his phone might be tapped and say we should go outside to talk and leave the phone inside. He was actually cutting off, the meeting was all about cutting off contact with this man because of the controversy surrounding their relationship. But nevertheless, if more material comes out about that meeting or anything else concerning their contact, then I think it will be really very bad for the senator, and many people would think that this is really unacceptable behaviour. And of course it comes just when a whole lot of people have had to leave Parliament or been thrown out of Parliament by the High Court over their dual citizenship, which, as the government has pointed out, has been a technical problem more than a substantive problem of having a loyalty to another country. And yet here we are having Sam Dastyari having this relationship with this Chinese national who's of interest to the agencies. And of course that relationship involved getting donation money and so appearing at a joint press conference contradicting Labor policy over the South China Sea and being very sympathetic to China's line on that issue.
Has this sort of thing happened before in Australian political history? Is there any sort of precedent that we can reflect on?
There was in the 1980s the so-called Combe-Ivanov affair, when a former ALP National Secretary, David Combe, had a boozy dinner with a guy who was a Soviet spy, and that led to all sorts of political ramifications, a royal commission. Now in the end Combe was found not to have compromised national security, but it was seen as a very important issue at the time.
Okay, so we should watch out for what happens in that area.
Indeed, it'll be interesting.
Thank you, Michelle, for reflecting on the week in politics. And we look forward to listening to Michelle's thoughts next week.